Good morning, everybody. Mr. Tinnel here. Today is Thursday, May 14th. Today we're going over the Korean War and the Vietnam War, going into a little more depth than we talked about on Tuesday. So, good things. I had an active day yesterday. Did a lot with school, had a few meetings. I went out and ran. I did some, I have like I don't know what you want to call them, like a rope system in my house, like where you can like hold on it and like do arm exercises. So did that. And yeah, it was a good day. And hopefully if the sun comes out, I'll get out and mow. Hopefully you guys are staying active and positive. So jumping into today, we have a presentation and guided notes that go along with it. So let me jump over and share that screen. World map we're going to talk about in a few. So we have our presentation and our guided notes. Hopefully you've figured out a good process for this, a process that works better for you, whether it's, kind of listening to me, listening to this presentation, watching this presentation, and then scrolling through this, looking through the presentation yourself while you listen to the video and reading through this first, and then going back and listening to the video, and then coming back and answering. But these are important. This is, are you getting the material? Because it is still important to soak in. I realize it's all a little different, but still really important stuff to know as Americans. So starting with the Korean War. So we're in the middle of the Cold War. The Truman Doctrine says we should go anywhere in the world where democracy is being threatened. That broadens to this idea of containment. So containment is the idea, going a little bit further from the Truman Doctrine, that communism should be stopped wherever it is. So Russia and China are the two large communist powers during the Cold War. Obviously, this was the Soviet Union, so a lot more countries were contained within Russia at that time. But the idea of the Truman Doctrine and then getting to containment is Russia and China should be contained. Communism should be contained and not allowed to leave that containment. Because if it leaves that containment, it's going to spread around the world. This idea of communism, authoritarianism spreading across the world. Containment and the Truman Doctrine lead to why we get involved in the Korean Peninsula. So this is where the Korean War takes place. See China, Japan, and even just right up to the north of it, this is Russia. This is Russian territory. So we're looking at the Korean Peninsula. So two different governments were established on the Korean Peninsula after World War II. Basically, communists got a little bit and democracy got a little bit. The North was communist. The South is democratic. Quick YouTube video supplemental if you want to watch that. But in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, there's a very easy way to remember which side's communist and which side's not. The sides that are communists are the sides that touch China. If the country was touching a communist country, then that country would be communist. In North Korea is touching China. So that leads to easy support for North Korea by China. So North Korea is communist. South Korea is democratic. And this guy might look a little familiar. His name is Kim Il-sung. He is the founder of North Korea. Kim Il-sung might sound a little familiar because his son is Kim Jong-il, and his son is the current president, Kim Jong-un. And if you look at them, grandson and grandfather look, very similar. You can tell they're related. So the Kims still run the country. The family of the Kims were the ones who established communist North Korea, and they still run it today. So you see the division here. This line is going to become very important. North Korea wants to control the entire peninsula, and they have weapons and support from the Soviet Union and China. China does fight in this war, but the Russians do not. The Russians don't put troops in. China does, but weapons and support come from the Soviet Union and China. So the South was outnumbered. North Korea had nearly 200,000 troops, 210 fighter planes, 280 tanks. That support from the Soviet Union and North Korea meant that they needed help. So they get help from the United States and the UN. The UN and the United States lead the charge to support South Korea. We as the United States put troops in, and then the UN, joined by a bunch of other countries around the world, allies around the world, join in to push back this threat of the North. Soviet Union walked out on an emergency meeting in the UN, angry at the organization. The United States forces the North Korea all the way back to their border with China. However, China forces 850,000 people back to the 38th parallel. And so you see that here, we see this push. Communist forces push south, and then the US, UN, and South Korea pushed all the way north, and then North Korea pushed back south until we ended up meeting in the middle, figuratively and literally. We start seeing President Truman and decorated General Douglas MacArthur get into some tension. Lightbox goes into a little bit more detail with this. MacArthur wanted to go on and just attack China. Like, we just got out of a world war and you want to attack China. So he more so wanted to use atomic bombs. And even though he was a brilliant general in the Pacific, did amazing things for the United States in World War II, Truman fired him because it's one thing to defend South Korea, it's another to start another world war. Because obviously, think about this. If we attack China, think about the alliance system. What's the next thing that's going to happen if we attack China? Who's joining? Russia, the Soviet Union. So it was a smart move by Truman. So now we get to a ceasefire. Ceasefire was signed in 1953 after 3 years of war. Saw 36,000 American deaths, over 1 million North Korean and Chinese troops killed. There were over 100,000 UN and South Korean troops killed. But we don't see peace. And this is a very interesting thing with the Korean War. is that line, the DMZ, along the 38th parallel. This line is known as the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. This is the division of North Korea and South Korea still today. There are troops all along this border still today because the Korean War is not over. The Korean War never ended. It ended in an armistice. It ended in a ceasefire. So basically, each side is still technically on guard. There's not peace in the Korean War. So U.S. Commander Mark Clark signed a truce and later lamented that he had gained the inevitable and unenviable distinction of being the first United States Army commander in history to sign an armistice without victory. The war was never technically won. See the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C., right next to the Vietnam War Memorial, which we will see now. So the Vietnam War is really complicated. It's complicated for the fact that in North Korea and South Korea, so going back to the Korean War for a second, that was a war between two sides. Two sides were trying to establish themselves as their own country. Vietnam is a different conflict that we don't fully understand because it's not necessarily two sides fighting for democracy or communism. What's going on in Vietnam is it's just a civil war. It's not that one side wants their ideology. It's just that one side wants to be in control. And we never fully understand that in Vietnam. We never actually understand that it's not this, the North Vietnam is fighting for communism. No, they're not fighting for communism. They're fighting for North Vietnam. They want to control the country. They don't want to push communism. Yeah, they do want to push communism, but it's not about pushing communism. It's about controlling the country. And so once again, thinking about what side is what. So we see Vietnam, and it's all one country. It's not divided north and south, which might tell you something. But during the Vietnam War, it was divided north and south. Again, China is up here. So which side of Vietnam would have been communist? The north. North is touching communist China. So North Vietnam was controlled by the communists. So Ho Chi Minh declares North Vietnam independent from France. So the division exists for a while. 1959, the first troops, U.S. troops, are killed in South Vietnam. But we still don't technically start ramping our troop numbers up yet. 1961, things start to get heated when President Kennedy sends 400 Green Berets into Vietnam. But the actual event that starts this is in 1964. That is when the USS Maddox is allegedly attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It's a very controversial act. There's debate on what actually happened here. This ship was allegedly attacked. And if you remember back into the Spanish-American War, the USS Maine, it blew up in Cuba. And remember who blew it up? Nobody. It blew up itself. So We instantly blamed the Spanish, though. So because using that, we use that as a reason to get into the Spanish-American War. This is very similar. The ship had an incident, didn't necessarily involve the Vietnamese. We still used it to justify going into war with with Vietnam. So a resolution was passed allowing the United States to use military action in Vietnam. The things that happen in Vietnam are devastating. Jungle warfare, chemical warfare. We see this first modern jungle kind of guerrilla warfare. One of the big problems is you're marching through these villages and you don't know who's who. And this isn't just to justify what's happening in this next slide, but we see many acts by the military of civilians being killed because we don't know who's who. Now, that being said, in My Lai, next slide, we knew that this was a village of civilians not fighting in the war. But still, 500 people were killed. Innocent people were killed by the military. Horrors of war happening in Vietnam. 1969, it gets even more tense in the United States because a draft lottery begins. Everyone in the country, all men age 18 had it was possible that they would be drafted into war. They would be sent into war, involuntarily put into service in the military. Every 18-year-old man, unless you had medical issues that you could prove from doctor's notes. So America secretly bombs Cambodia, a neutral country. This escalation of the war leads to protests all across the country. One of those protests was at Kent State. Kent State was protesting the escalation of this war, looking like it was going to grow into more countries in Southeast Asia. Kent State had been on edge for days. There have been massive protests. A lot of the campus had been burned by protesters because protests had gotten out of hand. So the National Guard comes in. United States National Guard soldiers come in and come in to calm the situation. So you see a bunch of protesters out on a common green park area on Kent State's campus. They're all marching up against National Guard troops. All of a sudden, somebody suddenly hears something. National Guard troops start firing on unarmed protesters in America. Is mind-boggling. Mind-boggling that is how tense this whole situation got in this country. That we got to a point where shooting on unarmed protesters was an option. 1973, we do finally wrap up the Vietnam War. Long, bloody, seemingly pointless war. We wanted to contain communism, but that's not what this war was about. It was about two different sides of a country wanting to control it, not about the spread of communism. They could have cared less about the communism aspect. They wanted to control the country. The Paris Peace Accords were signed, ending American involvement in Vietnam. 1975, Saigon falls to communist forces. And as you saw on the Google map, there is no North and South Korea. It is only, or I apologize, there is no North or South Vietnam. It is only Vietnam. That's because the entire country of Vietnam is communist today. And let's just take a quick look. It's really funny to see what we fought against, because Vietnam's beautiful. Vietnam's doing very well, and they're communists. And you know, I'm not gonna like jump on this bandwagon of saying they're the greatest country ever, but this shows that it wasn't for communism. They were fighting for independence, their sides. We never understood that, which leads to 58,000 deaths, 1.1 million North Vietnamese, 250,000 South Vietnamese killed. Incredible death toll for a war that in the end was truly unnecessary. Most wars are unnecessary. One that was very sensitive area in American history, and one of the most kind of humbling spots that you go to in Washington, D.C. is the Vietnam Wall. See those 58,000 names on black granite. It just stretches out forever. Everyone that died is on that wall. It was a turning point in our country. We were sending our young men off to war. Vast majority of those that died were between 18 and 21. We were sending our young men off to war for a long war that we didn't really know why we were fighting in. One of the key tenets of war is understand what your enemy fights for, and we never understood that. So it's a shame that we wasted so many lives on a war that we didn't really need to be in. So that's this presentation for the day. We have one more lesson tomorrow. We're doing Lightbox. I'll walk you through that, talk you through how we're going to do it. I have some tips and hints to help it make it easier for you to get through. If you have any questions, let me know. As always, I hope you have a great Thursday, and I will see you tomorrow. Thanks, everybody. Bye.